Hello comrades, it's Comrade Reese here, and today I'm just going to be talking about racism and how the capitalist ruling class can use it to their own advantage. We are all living in a society called capitalism, and this society is governed by a tiny minority of rich parasites. An Oxfam report stated that just 80 multi-billionaires actually control more than half of the world's wealth. This gives them the power to basically fucking dictate governments and pretty much control the entire capitalist world. This tiny minority of parasites got rich, and they keep on getting richer by exploiting the labour power of the vast majority of humanity, including you. I live in Britain, and my country is an imperialist country, and in order to keep it that way, the capitalist ruling class in my country need to safeguard their insanely huge amounts of wealth and power against the interests of the working class. The capitalist ruling class in my country has a very sneaky, crafty, and just a simply bloody insidious trick to divide working people against one another. Under capitalism, even the best off workers are a lot worse off than they will be under socialism, and even the most well-off workers are still losing sleep over a lack of security, as even the best off workers still worry about whether or not they will still have a job tomorrow, whether or not they will still have a home to live in tomorrow, whether or not they will still have access to healthcare, whether or not their children will be able to have a decent education, and whether or not they will still have their pensions. Why do you think that the worker on the service counter in the restaurant smiles at you when you walk through the door? Generally, it's not because he or she loves their job, but because they want that paycheck that will feed their family. Like I've said, the capitalist ruling class in my country and in all other imperialist countries use a very insidious trick to turn working people against one another. That insidious trick is called racism, and it is one of the main weapons that our rulers use against all of us. The reason why they do this is because it is a crafty way of redirecting the anger and frustration that should be focused on the rotten system of capitalism at our fellow workers instead. Bourgeois parties and bourgeois politicians come and make every single promise to you before the elections. But their job is not to bring benefits to working people, but to protect the interests of the capitalist ruling class, which is the exploiting class. By doing this, they turn a blind eye to the pollution of the planet. They send working class soldiers off to their deaths in predatory, unjust and imperialist wars to control the world's resources and markets, and they also force down as far as possible the wages that workers receive to look after themselves and their families. The ongoing cuts to our social housing, our NHS, our education provision, our welfare safety network, and all of the other services that form a part of our social wage are being motivated by a drive for a cheaper workforce. This has also led to attacks on trade union rights and pension schemes, and it also leads to the export of capital, which means that British capitalists close down enterprises in my country in order to produce more capital for a cheaper price abroad, where workers receive far less both directly in wages and also indirectly in benefits and services. This is what boosts their profits, but it deprives millions of workers in my country of our traditional occupations, and it is destroying our local communities. All of this is done in the interest of maintaining profit, especially right now, because we are currently facing a time of crisis, so profits are a lot more difficult to come by, which is why the role of the capitalist politicians and their puppets in the media is to ensure that the blame for all of the corruption, all of the destitution, all of the misery, and all of the fucking horrible crimes like murder or armed robbery are not laid on the capitalist system itself, which is actually what causes these problems, but on some minorities of the working class, like the immigrants or the asylum seekers. They too are suffering big time from the attack on living standards. This is why all of the bourgeois political parties in my country, especially the five main ones, so the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, UKIP, SNP and the Tories, have to be racist. A part of their role is to ensure that workers from different communities and different countries are encouraged to be hateful towards each other's traditions and religious beliefs. and this implements a strategy of divide and rule that has been used by minority ruling classes for centuries. As opposed to actually recognising that all workers are our class brothers and sisters, the capitalist ruling class do everything in their power to try and encourage us to identify with our own exploiters because they have the same colour of skin, the same language, the same culture or religious affiliation. Racial and national prejudices are purposely renewed and reinforced by capitalism's puppets in Westminster. This can definitely explain why racism in our capitalist society can't just be educated away, because even when ordinary people try so hard to prove that they can get along just fine and that racism is just fucking stupid, there are still thousands of stories in ruling class-controlled corporate media aimed at cooking up racial tension and manufacturing discrimination in the minds of workers. Even the better-off white workers in my country, as well as all of the other imperialist countries, such as the United States of America, suffer too as a result of racism. And the reason for this is because the divided working class is not able to organise an effective fight to replace the racist, warmongering capitalist system with a socialist society in which we can all live a secure, meaningful, cultured and dignified life, free from all forms of discrimination, poverty and war. Therefore, this is why we Marxist-Leninists see racism as a class issue, and not just for some people whose skin colour or ethnic background leads to them being directly targeted and victimised. As a communist, I am very much against racism, not just because it is morally and scientifically unjustifiable, but also because of the effect that racism has in dividing and weakening the struggle of the working class for their freedom from capitalist slavery. Population migration has been a feature of human life for as long as we have existed as a species on this planet, and now, under imperialism, it has reached its apex, as the combination of forced and voluntary movements of people have reached huge sizes. Under capitalism, mass migration can't be stopped as much as wage slavery itself. Even in the earliest days of capitalism, people found themselves having no choice but to move from the countryside to the towns in order to find work and support their families. In the present day, especially in my country, many people have no choice but to leave their homes in one part of the country and look for work somewhere else in the country. For instance, I live in Wales, and after graduating from college or university, many students find themselves moving to London just to get a well-paid job as a graphics designer or a video editor or a top-notch scientist, because while there are jobs in Wales, they are often very low paid, they are often 0-hour contract jobs, and the working conditions are fucking terrible. A lot of people ask me the question of, should workers demand a stop to all of this kind of migration, or where would I draw the line, or should there be border controls at the edge of every country? Now, the argument seems just downright fucking ridiculous. However, there is really no difference between this kind of migration and the international kind. In both cases, people are forced to make a living, and in both cases, capitalism does benefit from the free movement of labour. For instance, the tenets of the European Union are the free movement of labour and the free movement of capital. So people from the poorer European countries like Poland or Romania end up moving to the rich imperialist countries in Europe like Britain, France or Germany, because for them that is where the money is. However, they just find themselves getting used for cheap labour. As soon as capitalism went global, so did its contradictions. Just as capitalist exploitation and the concentration of wealth started to push peasants off the land and into the towns, imperialist wars and economic super-exploitation all over the world made wave upon wave of migration, because the new conditions of life forced many millions of workers to leave their homes in the oppressed countries and move to the imperialist heartlands in the hope of being able to feed their kids. This objective really does make up for all of the more fucking ridiculous propaganda and all of the brutal repression being directed at the desperate migrants, refugees and asylum seekers in the French town of Calais and also in the Mediterranean Sea. Their names may be a mystery, but we all know what they were after and what they wanted. not just for themselves, but also for their loved ones. Just as much as we British workers want for ourselves and our loved ones a decent life, decent healthcare, a decent education and safety for their children, dignity, respect, and at least some hope for the future. These are not pleas and daydreams, but they are things that every worker should enjoy as a right, no matter what the colour of their skin is or what country they come from. So, if you actually look at the reasons why so many people fucking risk their lives in the hopes of realising such modest objectives in the imperialist countries, you would find them not only in several centuries of colonial super-exploitation and in the continued neo-colonial pillage, but also in the endless wars waged by the ruling class in my country against countries in Africa or the Middle East that stand up against imperialism and seek to pursue a development path that benefits their own people. For example, many of today's refugees come from Syria, which is a country that still struggles heroically to maintain and improve this in the face of a ruthless and relentless war on every front. But capitalism's only answer to this horrible result of its racist wars is more racism and more war. The media may occasionally choose to give prominence to the calls by that idiotic fuckwit, otherwise known as Nigel Farage, for the army to be deployed against our classed brothers and sisters and our fellow workers, but the stance of Labour and the Tories is just as bad. The only real difference is that Labour and the Tories have just done far more than Nigel Farage, as Labour and the Tories have actually been in government to create this tragic situation in the first place. Therefore, it is very clear that we cannot stop immigration under capitalism. We should instead focus on the effect that such immigration has on the working class movement in my country, on workers' struggles for pay and conditions under capitalism, and on the struggle for socialism. In fact, many of the poisonous effects of racism on the working class movement explain why communists want the abolition of all immigration controls as a progressive step that would help to eradicate the catastrophic division that holds us back. Immigrants are not the enemies of the British working people. Capitalism is the enemy of the British working people. This is why we, the communists, fight for the full citizenship for all people who live or work in this country, because by classifying workers as illegal leaves them as prey to the most extreme exploitation and abuse, and it turns them into weapons of the capitalists to depress the wages of all workers. The best way to stop illegal immigrants from lowering conditions and wages for British workers is to fight for the removal of their illegal status. And as to the arguments of the migrants putting a strain on the welfare system, and that since our taxes pay for them, it is unfair for people who come from abroad to take advantage, these are more of the bullshit assertions put out by the bourgeois media and the bourgeois politicians to fuel anti-immigrant racism. It is widely misunderstood that the social provision that was provided in all of the Western imperialist countries after the Second World War was the product of a very special set of events. In particular, it was a response to the threat of a revolution after the devastation of Europe and the victories of, and the great example set by, the Soviet Union. The ruling classes of Western Europe were all aware that if they were not going to give substantial concessions and raise the living standards of workers, that workers were very likely to follow the example of our brothers and sisters in Eastern Europe and East Asia by overthrowing them and simply taking what we needed instead. The revolutionary sentiments of workers were bought off with temporary sops, and we did allow ourselves to be lulled back to sleep with some empty promises of a peaceful and gradual transition to socialism. We did also kind of turn a blind eye to the violent suppression and of the exploitation of the colonies of the British Empire that went hand in hand in paying for our public services. My country's post-war Labour government is so famous at home for establishing the NHS, but it is rightly envied abroad because it repressed the people of India, Greece, Malaya and Korea who were struggling for their emancipation. It is not so much the level of immigration that is causing imperialist governments all over the Western world to feel confident enough to attack our social provisions, but it is the decline of communist and anti-imperialist movements that has caused it. Therefore, this is the reason why only a proletarian revolution will have the power to end that, as it would make decent social facilities for all permanent, rather than just a temporary thing. The other reason for this is because capitalism will never put the interests of working class people first, and it will only provide the minimum that it can get away with at any given time. Only socialism will put the interests of the working class first. So my question is, how can we really accuse people from the oppressed countries who have been robbed and impoverished by the imperialists who transfer their country's wealth over to the financial centres of imperialism, like Wall Street or the City of London, of taking advantage, if they find that they have no other choice other than to come and live in my country in order to make a living and survive? We all need to recognise that it is the capitalist ruling class's insane and fucking brutal urge for profit that is causing our problems, not immigration. If we do not understand this, then we will all end up being as fucking stupid as the English Defence League or Britain First, who actually want to mobilise us against our own class to save capitalism. People who fall for these fucktards are being turned into puppets of the capitalists against their own class interests. They are in great danger of finding themselves in the wrong side of the fight when the capitalist class decides to start a mass-scale violent suppression of the working class to eliminate the threat of a proletarian revolution. But I do have to say, for anybody who is just about to go full-on caps lock in the comment section, that it is not only British white workers who get fooled by the capitalists in this way. Non-white workers and even religious minorities get encouraged to keep themselves apart to avoid contamination by Western culture, or to organise themselves in a separate group filled with black nationalists who believe that all white people are KKK apologists, rather than actually opening up their mind to see that it is really the capitalists who are the enemies of the working people, nationally and internationally. Class-conscious workers of all nations and all cultures need to pick up the powerful weapon of Marxism-Leninism and learn how to use it in order to finally put an end to the division of our communities and to unite them in the common fight against the capitalists to establish socialism. As Marx and Engels put it in the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a world to win.
Lenin and the Bolsheviks plotting the end of exploiters and war, saying no defense of Russia's so-called interest in conflict. Workers of the world got no stake in bloodshed. Oppressed nationalities had no place